Nobody loves to wheel and deal on draft weekend like John Schneider, but is there more than meets the eye when it comes to his draft weekend tactics? Rob Rang and I are going to be breaking it down on the latest offering of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12s. This is Corbin Smith, your host for Locked On Seahawks. Joining me for our Thursday episode, it's my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. Thanks, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We got a jam-packed episode coming your way. We're going to continue our free agency primer series at the tight end position with Will Dissly, and we're going to be checking out what changes may be on the horizon for the Seahawks with their cornerback group as they adjust their scheme towards more man coverage. Now for your lead story here on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Over the years, John Schneider has rightfully earned the reputation as one of the great draft weekend trade artists in the NFL, particularly trading down. We've seen him countless seasons, whether they had a pick in the first round or it was early second round, maneuvering the draft board and trading down. According to Pro Football Focus, a chart that was released today, John Schneider has traded down 19 times since 2011 among the top three in the NFL. No surprise, the only executive ahead of him is Bill Belichick. And we know that the Patriots like to wheel and deal as well. So John Schneider has been as willing to trade down as any executive in the NFL. But there may be more than meets the eye when it comes to his trade tactics, Rob, because as much as he adores trading down, you and I think we were both shell-shocked by this when we looked at the data today, but John Schneider is also one of the most likely executives in the NFL to trade up, and he has been extremely effective when he has done so.
Yeah, and that's the thing, Corbin, is that he has traded up more times than people might think. And when he has done so, he's been very effective in that aggression. And I think that this is a unique draft class that actually offers the Seahawks a great deal of opportunity in doing so. We have been basically kind of, hammering at the table, basically saying that Seattle has to be aggressive in free agency. But I do think that the salary cap dollars are going to wind up being used pretty quickly if Seattle winds up bringing back some of their free agents from their own team. But at the same time, and when it comes to the draft, I think that this draft class sets up pretty well for the Seahawks' needs. And we've talked before about how Seattle needs to have help at the cornerback position. They need to have help at the edge rusher position. I would argue those are the two strongest positions in this year's draft class. And maybe you'll be able to get a really good football player at number 41 overall. But at the same time, you might be able to get a special player if you trade back up into the first round. And the fact that there is not a lot of really exciting quarterbacks this year, I think that there could be some teams in the mid and late portions of the first round who are a little bit more willing to wheel and deal and not expect, just a whole bunch of picks in return for that. And so I think that this is one of those draft classes, Corbin, that's a little bit unique. It could be one, and it's a little bit of a seller's market, a buyer's market. And Seattle might be willing to kind of buy and move up a little bit, whereas most draft classes are the seller's market. And we saw just this past year what the huge price that the San Francisco 49ers paid to move up to get Trey Lance, and then they wound up starting Jimmy Garoppolo the entire time we went to the NFC Championship game. I think that this year is a little bit different in that regard, that the Seahawks might be one of those teams who might be able to really, truly exploit the fact that there is not a lot of great quarterbacks in this year's draft class, might be able to move up. And as some of the data that was just released that you were referencing before suggests, John Schneider has been willing to do that more often in the past than I think that the national consensus would suggest. And when he has done so, he has been very effective.
Yeah, you look back at the past, going back to 2015, John Schneider has traded up 7 times, and I'll dive into the numbers here real quick, but he has selected 3 all-pro players with those draft choices. He's picked 2 other players that are starters, one in Darrell Taylor that has Pro Bowl, maybe even all-pro potential as a ceiling. Really the only trade that he made moving up that right now there's a big question mark on in terms of value was when they traded up for Stone Forsythe, and that was moving up in the 6th round. It's not like that was a day 2 or day 1 trade up where they had to give up a whole bunch. All that he had to do was give up an extra 7th rounder to move up 7 spots to get Stone Forsythe, and Forsythe could still end up being a starter down the line. That's just not where he's at this stage of his career. But certainly that is something we'll monitor as time goes on. But 2015, Tyler Lockett, John Schneider traded 4 draft picks to the Washington Commanders to get pick number 65 in the 3rd round to draft Tyler Lockett. I think that was a pretty good investment, getting a perennial 1,000-yard receiver, an all-pro as a kick returner coming into the league, immediately paid dividends. The next season, they traded up in the 2nd round to get Jarran Reed, added a 4th round pick with their 2nd rounder to move up to get him. Jarran Reed had 5 very productive seasons as a starter at defensive tackle. A few years later, in 2019, the Seahawks traded up to get DK Metcalf. Patriots had that pick at number 64. Metcalf's got over 3,000 receiving yards and almost 30 receiving touchdowns in his first 3 seasons. Think that was a pretty good investment, just giving up a 3rd and 4th rounder to move up to that position. In that same draft, they traded up a few spots in the 3rd round to get Cody Barton, just swapped 5th and 6th rounders with the Vikings. He has been a solid core special teams player. To me, it was worth the trade moving up to get him. He could still potentially be a starter down the line for you as well. Still a very young player. And then, as I mentioned, Darrell Taylor, most recently being a player that they traded up to acquire from the New York Jets, moved up 11 picks in the 2nd round, had 6.5 sacks last year. So more times than not, really the vast majority of the time that John Schneider has traded up, he has hit gold. They've been able to bring in all-pro caliber players, whereas when he's traded down a bunch of times, they've ended up with players like Malik McDowell or having 2 first-rounders in the spot they stay at. They get LJ Collier. That tactic has not worked for them at all over the years. They've had a few instances where it did. They traded down 3 picks and still got Bruce Irvin in 2012, for example. But most of the time that they have traded down, they've ended up with players like Malik McDowell or Christian Michael that simply didn't pan out or didn't play any snaps for them at all. So this year, without that 1st round pick and having a 2nd rounder that's early in the 2nd round, something they have not had because they've consistently been a playoff team, like the free agency approach, this seems like the year that John Schneider's got to look at the data and be like, you know what? I'm better when I am swinging for the fences moving up than trying to recoup picks. This whole quantity over quality thing is very evident to me that their best picks have been when they've been willing to package picks together and move up so that they can get really talented football players. And so maybe he needs to adopt the Mickey Loomis model in New Orleans and say, you know what? I'm done with the trading down. I don't care if I make 4 or 5 picks. My 4 or 5 picks are going to be damn good selections. And he's had good luck doing that.
He has had good luck doing that. And I would argue that, the Seattle's draft last year and the fact that they had the undrafted free agency success that they have had so many years in the past, that just kind of continued again, this past season. Of course, when you have at the right tackle position, they were able to get the player that they got at the linebacker position. They were able to get the player that they got. That just kind of speaks to the success of the ability of Seattle scouts to be able to evaluate talent. But sure, if you are in a position now to be able to move up from number 41 overall, which is Seattle's current number 1, or their first draft pick this year, and be able to get a guy in the late 20s, then I think that might make some sense this year. Again, it's a kind of a unique year this year, Corbin. So I do think that all this aggression that you are hearing, that people like us say that Seattle needs to show this year, everybody's kind of focusing on free agency. And with the NFL scouting combine starting up this next week, I think that our attention does need to start kind of focusing towards the draft. Certainly John Schneider's focus has always been on the draft. And I do think that this is one of those unique years in where Seattle might be able to kind of move forward and be able to really take advantage of this draft class. And so I'm intrigued by that. There's not very many players that Seattle has invested early draft picks in that haven't either been successful in Seattle or gone elsewhere and been successful. So that's one of the reasons why I am full bore thinking that the Seahawks will continue to hit the same home runs that they had, as I mentioned before, with Jake Curhan, or a reference before with Jake Curhan and John Radican, that they will continue to be successful with those late round picks. If they hit a couple of these early round picks this year, as I expect them to do, perhaps even in the first round, then I do think that this is the 2022 draft class that the Seahawks need to get back up to the top of the NFC West.
It would really change the narrative and really the numbers that we went through. John Schneider being tied for the third most trade up since 2011. That should change the narrative for everybody that jokes. And you and I have been guilty of it, joking about John Schneider always trading down. He's clearly been equally as aggressive and has enjoyed trading up over the years just as much. Maybe this year, coming off a 7-10 season with this draft class, 6 picks to work with. If he has a player that he really wants in the late 20s, end of the first round, even early second round, that he feels he can't get at 41, might roll the dice and move up again and try to get another impact player like a DK Metcalf or a Jaron Reed that he's been able to acquire in recent seasons. We're going to continue our free agency primers here in a moment, go into the tight end position with Will Dissly. Will he be back or will he be out of town in 2022? Football might be over for this season, but basketball is in full steam for both pro and college hoops. From all the latest odds, totals, player performance props, to where the next fired coach is going to land, betonline.net is the #1 spot for all of your sports betting needs. BetOnline remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline.net is your source for hockey, boxing, UFC, maybe baseball down the line. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline, where the game starts. You're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, Thursday edition. I'm Corbin Smith. Joining me, my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. Thanks for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Make sure to check out the Locked On NFL podcast as well. They're kicking out great coverage year-round on all major platforms, so make sure to download wherever you listen to your podcast. Continuing our free agency primer series, we're going back to the tight end position. We've already covered Gerald Everett in an earlier episode. We've looked at Sidney Jones and Al Woods earlier this week. Will Dissly obviously has been a fan favorite coming from the University of Washington, a kid that has been here for a long time in the Pacific Northwest, moved from the defensive line to tight end during his college career, a 4th-round pick for the Seahawks, overcame incredible adversity his first 2 seasons with a torn patellar tendon as a rookie that cost him 12 games, and then an Achilles injury that cost him 10 games in his second season. So 2 injuries that have derailed many a career, and yet both times he was able to battle his way back and return to form and be a valuable contributor for the Seahawks. Let's talk about his future in Seattle, because I'm under the viewpoint going into this free agency period that tight end is one of the better position groups in this free agent class. We've talked about how saturated this group is. You've got players like O.J. Howard that are going to be out there. Mo Alley Cox, I think, is one of the more underrated tight ends in football, former VCU basketball star. It's possible that Mike Gesicki will be out there from the Miami Dolphins. And there are a number of other tight ends in this class that are really good. Gerald Everett as well, as we've talked about. So it might be difficult for Will Dissly to get much more than a 1-year deal around league minimum, because he hasn't put up big numbers as a receiver the last couple of years. He's more of a in the trenches, do the dirty work style tight end. That may benefit the Seahawks, and I think he wants to stay here since he's been here since college. This seems like this could be a mutual arrangement, but at the same time, you've got that talent in the free agent market. You got a good draft class of the tight end position coming in. So I don't know that anything is set in stone in regard to him being back in 2022.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't think it's set in stone, but I also would agree with you in that I think that it's likely that Will Dissly is brought back. I think that there is going to be some interest on his side to return to the Pacific Northwest, as you mentioned. I mean that's where his his background lies, and then I think that he is a favorite not only of the fans but of the Seahawks scouting and coaching staff. I remember evaluating Will Dissly at that University of Washington Pro Day, watching John Schneider over there, watching some of their top scouts, and just listening to the silence, the beauty that was Will Dissly catching footballs. And there's not defensive linemen out there who are supposed to be able to catch the ball and have it just, quietly drop into their hands. Usually it kind of slaps against their hands because they don't know how to catch the football. They usually almost catch the ball like this rather than
Hard
with
leather
hands
hand.
out. Exactly. And Will Dissly show those natural hands that you just don't expect. And he certainly is a big physical man. Has that sneaky kind of speed. We've seen some of the big plays that he's made over his career. But the fact that this is a good free agent class, as you mentioned, this is a good draft class at tight end. It's not a draft class that has a great deal of high upside guys I expect to go in the first round, like Kyle Pitts a year ago. But there are going to be a number of tight ends who are going to go in the late portion of day 2 and all throughout day 3 that I think are really good football players. They just aren't special athletes. And I think that is all the more reason why Seattle might stick with their guy in Will Dissly, who also is not a special athlete. He's just a damn good football player. He's shown his heart in coming back from multiple injuries. He is a good blocker. I think that Will Dissly is very likely to come back to the Seahawks and very likely to be able to be retained on a pretty palatable contract. All the more reason why you'd like to have a guy like, quote unquote, Uncle Will come back because of just who he is as a football player on and off of the field and the fact that he fits in with what this club likes to do. They like to have some versatility at that tight end position.
Yeah, they want to have a grinder in the trenches that can play inline, and we've seen them try to do that with players that isn't a strength. Jimmy Graham, anyone? Maybe Colby Parkinson now on the roster. But Will Dissly, his defensive tackle background, it's natural for him to go out and block defensive ends, and he's very good at it. He had the 9th highest blocking grade in the run blocking department of the NFL per Pro Football Focus last year among tight ends. He's consistently been one of the higher graded tight ends in that department, and you can see his impact on the field. He did miss a couple of games late in the year, so you can't necessarily give him all the credit for helping open up run lanes for Rashad Penny, but in the games that he did play, he certainly played a role in that from a blocking standpoint. And you look back at the numbers he had his first 2 years, and this is still a young tight end in Will Dissly, coming back from those injuries. His rookie season, he had 8 catches for like 160-something yards and just came out of nowhere in 4 games, was one of their best receivers, and immediately had rapport with Russell Wilson. Gets that knee injury, comes back from that brutal patellar tendon surgery, comes back the next year, and he's again having a fantastic season. It cut short after 6 games. He had almost 450 receiving yards in 10 games his first 2 years. He has not been near as efficient in the passing game the last couple of years. He just hasn't been involved. It hasn't been his fault. He's had a catch rate above 80% each of the last 2 years. He just isn't getting opportunities. Some of that is the arrival of DK Metcalf. Last year, having Gerald Everett in the roster, there's only so many footballs to go around. But in the red zone, the lack of touches, just 1 touchdown last season, that has been my big concern with him the last few years. And I don't think a lot of it's his fault. I would love to see Shane Waldron find ways to get all those tight ends involved more in the passing game. It just hasn't worked out for Dissly, and maybe that helps the Seahawks again get him back at a cheaper price and afford to bring him back on a 1 or 2 year deal. And for that reason, I would project that he will be back next year. I think Seattle is going to go status quo at tight end because they can bring back Everett and Dissly at affordable prices with this being a saturated free agent class, a good draft class as well. Maybe they will draft a tight end too. That's certainly a possibility, but I expect Dissly to be back next season in large part because he's going to be affordable and he checks off a lot of the boxes the Seahawks are looking for. Other teams might be looking for that tight end that can stretch the field. Will Dissly isn't necessarily that guy, though he's shown at times he's capable and he surprises you. He's good at moving the chains when he's involved in the passing game. He's a stout run blocker. The Seahawks love to run the football. They're going to get back to doing that next year. So that's the big reason I think he's back next season.
I agree. But again, I think that the durability issue is a concern. It's kind of like we talked about a couple of days ago, Corbin, with Al Woods, and the age was a huge concern. You don't want to pay for what the player did last year. You want to pay for what they're going to bring you this upcoming season. And so I don't think that there's going to be a lot of NFL teams who are going to be willing to shell out big bucks for Will Dissly, even though you can make an argument if you just look at his statistics and the fact that he does have, pretty impressive yards after the catch and, some big plays early in his NFL career, but the lack of durability is disturbing. And this is a good, tight end class. I would be stunned if Seattle decided to go outside of the box and go with a free agent. Mike Gesicki is the one guy that I think I've been really intrigued by with Seattle for a long, long time. But other than that, and he plays a completely different type of role than Will Dissly does, I think the Seattle already has that guy with Colby Parkinson. But with Will Dissly, I don't think he's going to get a great deal of interest on the free agent market. And so that's why I think that Seattle is going to be able to bring him back on a relatively cheap contract. And that's part of the reason why you are likely to bring him back. It's just because that he is not going to command that much, and that's not going to do that much damage to your salary cap. So I do expect Will Dissly to come back to the Seahawks, and I think that's just going to make Seattle's tight end room that much stronger.
Yeah, I just think this is a position group, and you could make an argument countering this. Well, if there's so many good free agents and it's a good draft class, then why not go into that pool? But I still like this tight end group. I don't think they have been used as effectively as they should have been the last couple of years. And whether that's on the coordinators or whether that's on Russell Wilson or on everybody that's involved in that capacity, the tight ends have not been involved the way that I hoped they would be in the passing game. I'm hoping in year 2 with Shane Waldron, you see that ramped up some because they have a good group, and Will Dissly is one of those guys. We know he's capable of being a good receiver. You have to get him involved more somehow. I think that they like this player enough. They respect his work ethic, his grind coming back from injury. They're going to want him back in that locker room. He's respected by teammates, by coaches. So again, not that I would be stunned if he's not back, but I would be surprised. I expect that he will be back for a 5th season with the Seahawks. We're going to shift gear to the defensive side of the football now, Rob. Clint Hurtt, the new defensive coordinator, has talked in the past week and a half on a number of different interviews with local media, local radio stations about how he envisions this defense looking under his watch, and with Sean Desai and Carl Scott coming in as assistant coaches, leaning more towards a Vic Fangio type scheme. More blitzing, a more aggressive defense, less dropping defensive linemen into coverage, 3-4 structure. And then, of course, there's the man coverage element. To me, this is the biggest thing that jumped out, talking about adjustments schematically, because we have seen the Seahawks play more 2-deep coverages. We have seen them be aggressive. A couple years ago, Ken Norton Jr. blitzed more, in part because Jamal Adams and the talent he brings to the table. And they weren't getting pass rush with their front 4 anyway. So let's bring 5 or 6 and let's try to get after QBs. We've seen those evolutions in their scheme the last couple of years, but they were 31st in the league last year in cover 1 usage, according to True Media. And so they don't like playing man covers. That has not been their style. They like cover 3 historically under Pete Carroll, even with their 2-deep coverages, not a lot of man coverage out of those over the years. So that would be a big change up, and it requires a different style corner. Richard Sherman and Byron Maxwell, Brandon Browner, some of those bigger bodied long arm corners the Seahawks have preferred over the years. As great as Richard Sherman is, he thrived the way he did in part because the scheme was perfect for him. If you had him playing man coverage 50, 60% of the time, I don't think he has near the career in Seattle he did because it just doesn't fit his skill set. And so they're going to be looking at different corners. I think the good news, though, is they've already been doing that the last couple years. And even if they want to stay in-house, I guess that's where we start this conversation. DJ Reed and Sidney Jones, the 2 free agents set to hit the market, they both have skill sets that really cater well to man coverage.
They do. I mean, they have the loose hips. They have the quick change of direction. They have the fluid acceleration. Talking about two guys who are legitimate 4-4 guys, and so it is a completely different skill set. I mean, before we'd always been looking for Seahawks corners who are 6'1", 6'2". Those kind of long-legged, long-arm guys who would just maul you at the point of attack. And that's just not the type of players that Seattle has had success with here recently. And part of that is because of the lack of pass rush. Part of that is because of the fact that the NFL and the referees, that they're just changed. They just are calling the games differently now. I mean, you can't get through even a quarter of an NFL game anymore without having several different drives that are impacted by someone throwing a yellow hanky on the field. And so the fact that they have just completely changed how they're doing things, then I think the Seahawks have to adjust. Oh, by the way, you're playing against the Super Bowl champions with the Los Angeles Rams, who have a wide receiver in Cooper Kupp who just rewrote the record books, basically having the triple crown in the NFL. You're going up against a team in the Arizona Cardinals of Kyler Murray and all the talent that they have at the wide receiver position. It's just a different game now than it was when Pete Carroll first signed on to become the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks. So, yeah, I think that this is really going to be the most fascinating conversation we're going to have in the offseason. I know everybody wants to talk about Russell Wilson. He might get traded. Come on. Let's focus in on what's more likely to happen at the corner, not the quarterback position, but the cornerback position. The fact that Seattle's two starting cornerbacks both played pretty damn well last year in DJ Reed and Sidney Jones. Is Seattle going to be able to retain those players, one or both? I think that they should make both of them a priority. DJ Reed's success that he's had, the fact that he has been a more durable player throughout his college and NFL career, I think makes him the higher priority. But at the same time, I'm not so sure that Seattle is going to be able to do so. It's one of the reasons why in the mock draft that I have at Fox Sports right now, I have Seattle using that number 41 overall selection on another shorter, twitchier, instinctive cornerback and Roger McCreary from Auburn, because I do think that is the route that Seattle is going to be taking here. So, you saw it last year with DJ Reed, or 2 years ago with DJ Reed and Sidney Jones this past year, the selection of Trey Brown this past year. Seattle isn't waiting to make this transition with Clint Hurtt, Sean Desai, Carl Scott, et cetera, et cetera. They've already made that transition. And to me, that is really what this comes down to is Seattle able to bring these guys back? And if not, I think that's going to be their new MO at CB, is the shorter guys, the quicker guys. And I think there's a lot of them in this draft class, a lot of them in this free agent class. That's why, again, I think this sets up very, very nicely in 2022.
Yeah, I think when, all the discussions I've had with various sources that are associated with the team and know what the team's planning to do in free agency and where, I've been told Quandre Diggs, those discussions are already ongoing. From what I've gathered, I can't 100% confirm this, but I'm expecting they've had discussions with DJ Reed as well. The priority is keeping this secondary together. And so, some might argue, how can you know these guys are good at man coverage? You've hardly played it. But DJ Reed last year, 13 targets, gave up 5 receptions. Yeah, one of them was a touchdown, but that's less than a 50% completion rate. He has the athleticism, his physicality, his willingness to go up and press people, and then being able to recover because of his quickness, those loose hips you mentioned. He has the physical tools to be a successful man corner. He had a 52% completion rate against him, according to Pro Football Focus, in 2020 in man coverage, and he was very effective in that capacity. Sidney Jones has had a bit more issue because he can be aggressive. He can be a gambler at times, and he can pay for that with big plays over the top. I felt like he grew some out of that late last year, though. We saw a corner that was really maturing in this defense, and he's still only 26 years old. You take a 68-yard catch he gave up against the Rams in week 5 out of the equation, and he also had really good numbers in man coverage a year ago. He's done some nice things. He has all the physical tools and the athleticism and the ball skills to be a successful man cover corner. Trey Brown targeted 3 times, not a big sample size, obviously, but no completions against him. So they have the guys there. If they just want to retain their secondary, they have the guys to be good in man coverage. I think we have to explore the other possibility here, though, because what if DJ Reed does get a big contract in free agency from somebody else? It's certainly possible. And, maybe Sidney Jones, because he's a young player and he at one point was looked at as a first-round talent. Maybe he gets some offers that are $5-6 million, and the Seahawks say, we don't want to go that expensive. They might want to look at some other free agent options, or maybe they are less optimistic about those guys in man coverage than you and I are from looking at the film, looking at the stats. This is a free agent group that could potentially, and I'm using that word in quotes here because players like J.C. Jackson probably get franchise tagged before they hit the free agent market, but it potentially could be a group that's got some firepower with some really good man cover corners. J.C. Jackson would obviously be the cream of the crop. 30 completions allowed on 62 targets a year ago. Looking at all the numbers here, Rob, 5 interceptions, 9 pass breakups, an 89 grade in man coverage from Pro Football Focus. He was easily the best man cover corner last year in the NFL. He's consistently been since entering the NFL. But you're going to have to pay a lot of money if he hits the free agent market. I don't see this being a position the Seahawks are going to splurge, especially given their very shaky track record signing veteran corners in free agency.
Yeah, that's the thing. I do not expect Seattle to allocate a whole bunch of their funds to a cornerback who did not play for the Seahawks last season. If they're going to spend a lot of money, then I think it's going to be in DJ Reed and Sidney Jones, and I do expect them both to get offers in the $5-6 million range. I mean, as you mentioned, Corbin, I mean, Sidney Jones was expected to be a first-round pick. He was a first-round pick until he tore his Achilles tendon. That exact same workout I referenced before with Will Dissly being there and watching John Schneider and the Seahawks scouts attend that workout. And he still wound up going in the second round to the Philadelphia Eagles, even with that Achilles tear that basically ruined his rookie season. Just the draft happening just a couple of months after he had that season-ending injury. So NFL teams knew exactly what he was. DJ Reed is the biggest surprise. I mean, he's a 5th-round pick, and having the success that he's had previously in San Francisco and now with Seattle, I think that he is a little bit more of a surprise. And I mentioned in that the fact that he was a day 3 selection because of the fact that I think that is the biggest evidence that the Seahawks fans need to be a little bit comforted by the fact that Pete Carroll is one of the best in all of the NFL when it comes to coaching up defensive backs, even from his head coaching position. The success of the Legion of Boom and all of the cornerbacks who have come since then, I think speaks to that. The fact that John Schneider pulled off the heist that it was in bringing in DJ Reed from your divisional opponent, the San Francisco 49ers. You stole Quandre Diggs from the Detroit Lions in that trade. I think, again, just kind of proves that the Seahawks know what they're doing at the cornerback position. We'll talk about this more as we go. If Seattle is going to allocate big-time funds for a big-time free agent, I think it's going to be a pass rusher or perhaps a center, maybe even a left tackle. But I would be stunned if they wind up going for a guy like a J.C. Jackson or somebody like that in free agency, though I do think that those players are really good ones. I think the more likely scenario is that they retain the players that are played for Seattle a year ago, or they go back to the drawing board with this NFL draft. I mean, the highest drafted cornerback of the Seahawks, current regime, John Schneider and Pete Carroll, was Shaq Griffin, a Pro Bowler who wound up going to Jacksonville Jaguars on a massive contract. I have great confidence in Seattle to be able to take advantage of this 2022 draft class, be able to get themselves a good young corner, just like they did a year ago with Trey Brown, because of the fact that they do know what they are doing. This draft class is loaded at the cornerback position. If you fix the pass rush, you fix the secondary. It really is that simple.
Yeah, I agree with you. There are some names that could be intriguing in free agency. Obviously, J.C. Jackson is a superstar, one of the best corners in the NFL. And like I said, I think he's the best man cover corner in the league. I don't think New England's going to let him hit the market no matter what. He's going to get franchise tagged. Too good of a player, perfect fit for their scheme. They're not going to let him get away. You have a player like, say, Stephon Gilmore, who's going to be 32, is still a good man cover corner, but he's had injuries, is still going to cost some money. I don't see Seattle going that route. One name that does kind of intrigue me a little bit is Charvarius Ward, who played for the Kansas City Chiefs the last 4 years. And he gave up 13 receptions on 34 targets in man coverage last year. He was one of the better man cover corners in the league, and he's 25 years old as well. But if J.C. Jackson doesn't hit the market, given his age, Ward might actually be the biggest money corner in this free agent class. I could see teams dishing out big bucks, like 12, 13, 14 million a year for Ward, even though he has not been a Pro Bowler or an All-Pro to this point. His numbers back up his skill set at that man cover corner position. And so I think there'd be a number of teams that would be throwing big cash at him. And even if JC Jackson is out there, Ward is going to get paid probably 9-10 million minimum. So I'm with you. I think if the Seahawks are going to spend their money at the cornerback position, it's going to be on guys they're familiar with, that they've already had in their scheme. They're still going to be using kick step technique, according to Clint Hurtt. So that's not changing. They're going to want their guys back, or they're going to want to bring in some rookies. Maybe they mix it up. Maybe they bring back DJ Reed and they draft a corner. Nothing's going to stop them from doing that if they want to add extra depth through this draft class. And so it's going to be very exciting to see what the Seahawks choose to do, because this, to me, as I mentioned earlier, is the biggest schematic change that they are making defensively. We have already seen touches of 3-4 defense in Pete Carroll's defense dating back to his time at USC. We've already seen them blitz more some seasons. We have seen them already mix in more 2-deep coverages the last couple of years. But man coverage, that has never been a big staple in Pete Carroll's defense. So if they do that this next season, that's going to be an adjustment. The good news is the type of corners they have been bringing in recently, philosophical changes in terms of athleticism, size, arm length, you name it, they actually are better set up to be able to have the personnel there, re-signing a few of these guys to be successful running those man coverage schemes. So it's going to be exciting to see how this plays out here over the next couple of months in free agency and the draft. Thanks as always for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Now make your second listen the Locked On NFL Draft Podcast. Ryan Tracy and former NFL cornerback Eric Crocker bring the NFL draft to life every day with insight and analysis on college football prospects and NFL front offices. It's free and available wherever you get your podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to check out Locked On Seahawks on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and of course, 5 days a week, video streaming on YouTube. Coming up on our Blue Friday episode, I'll be rejoined by Nick Lee. The two of us are going to continue our division by division series, looking at the AFC South, which free agents from those four teams could be intriguing to the Seahawks as we approach the start of the new league year. Plus, we'll be answering your questions in our weekly mailbag. You won't want to miss it. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Go Hawks.